3 prisoners are escorted by a soldier to a science lab. They were put in a small building with a transparent glass. The scientist outside the room told them to state their name, age and weight, which they did. The first man is named Felix, 41 years old. The second guy is named Ulrich, 29 years old, and the youngest among them is Hans, 19 years old. After the little introduction, the scientist told them they are to undergo an experiment that will benefit the Soviet Union soldiers. The experiment is for them to stay in the room they are and be tested with a gas in the room. He assures them the gas is not a dangerous one and there would be no physical harm throughout the experiment. The scientist asked the prisoners if they are willing to go through the experiment. Before they could answer, he reminds them that anyone who is not interested in the experiment is to be eliminated immediately. They have no choice but to comply. The scientist also promised to make each of them a free man for them to return to their country after the conduction of the experiment. After this, he told them they would release the gas in a few moments and they should get familiar with the room. The scientist also told them there's enough food for them, books and toilet for the obvious, and he also told them no one would enter the room after they release the gas. After saying this, he released the gas. On the first day, their behaviors are still normal. Felix is reading, Ulrich keeps walking across the room, and Hans is just sitting on the floor. Felix started the conversation with Hans. He said they should know little about themselves since they would be together for a while. He guessed about what brought Hans to prison, but only his last guess is correct. He also asked Ulrich, but he didn't reply. Felix told Hans he would share his story if Hans is willing to share his. Hans agreed. Felix told them he used to be a top scientist that specializes in extraction and experimentation of human body parts, which seems like a torture to those operated on. Hans also shared his story. He used to be a soldier and he was stationed outside of Berlin for his night duty, but he slept off that night, and when he woke up everyone around him were slaughtered. He tried to escape by running as far as he could, but he was captured and brought to prison. They asked Ulrich to also share his story, but he neglects them and start doing push-ups. On the 4th day, the scientist continues his documentation. None of them had slept for the past 4 days and they were not abnormalities, which means the gas is effective. On this 4th day, Ulrich is still walking across the room. Felix confronted him and asked him to also share his story. Instead of sharing his story, Ulrich grabbed Felix's neck and forced him to the wall. The scientist outside warned him not to do anything funny, else he would be shot. A man in uniform appeared in the room's corner and only Ulrich could see him. He immediately released Felix and went to sit down across the room. On the 7th day, the scientist continues his documentation. He included Ulrich's behavior in his report. Other than that, everything seems good with the inmates. Ulrich is working out when Hans called him and asked what happened the other day. He replied he almost killed Felix and that's all. Hans told him no one intervened, but he ended up dropping Felix without harm and it seems like he saw a ghost. Hans convinced him to at least share his story. He agreed and told him he also used to be a soldier like Hans, but not a very good one. One day in the camp he was stationed at, his superior, whom he knew since he was a kid, killed himself. He shot himself through the mouth, and he doesn't really understand why he did that. Hans complained he's tired and he hasn't slept for days. Felix replied him none of them has slept too, and that must be the effect of the gas. Ulrich then said they want to use the gas for the soldiers for them to be more active. Ulrich told Hans to just think of the freedom they promised them after the experiment. Hans told him does he really think they would release them after the experiment. Hans tries to force himself to sleep but to no avail. On the 12th day, the scientist continues his documentation. Hans has been screaming for the past 7 hours. He said it seems strange because other inmates hasn't reacted to the gas. Hans has now been screaming for past 12 hours before he starts to whimper faintly because he has destroyed his vocal cords. Felix checked the scientist, staring at him through the transparent glass before he spat at him and left. On the 15th day of the experiment, the scientist continues his documentation, but this time he sounds so sleepy. He slept off not knowing the inmates have been looking at him in an odd way. The inmates starts hallucinating and they all look weird. As the scientist wakes up, the transparent glass has been covered with paper and blood. He saw Felix and told him to remove it before Felix covered the whole thing. The scientist continues his documentation and he includes the scenario in it and also said he doesn't know what is going on in but he knows they are still alive. On 20th day of the experiment, the scientist announced to the inmates that the experiment has come to an end. He instructed them to stand against the wall. After examination they would be free. One of them replied the scientist they don't want to be free anymore in a strange voice. A soldier went in to remove the papers and escort them to the examination room, but he was brutally killed by the inmates. As they went in to take them for examination, the inmates are now covered with blood and they seem like a bloodthirsty creature. They rushed Hans to the emergency room. He tried to talk but couldn't because of his damaged vocal cord. they inject anesthesia into his body and he died immediately. They also took Felix to the emergency room. He told them to put him on the gas back. They tried to inject anesthesia into his body. As he saw the injection, he told them operate on him without it. As they inject it to his body, he also died immediately. The scientist meets Ulrich in the room. They were locked. He asked him what happened after they covered the transparent glass with papers. Ulrich starts saying things unrelated to the question he asked him. This made the scientist ask what he is. Ulrich's eyes has been unplugged from his face. He answered the scientist question that he is awake. The scientist continues his documentation about the experiment. He said whether or not people believe these men deserve what happened to them doesn't really matter. He hopes people forgive him for the experiment, and he's sure history would never forget these men. And as for him, he can still erase what he has done. After he finished this record for the experiment documentation, he opened a gas to fill the room, sat on a chair and lit himself on fire. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos.